So hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, apologies for the slight delay. We were just giving time to people to find the room, as we took quite a lot of time ourselves. And good afternoon also to our panelists. But let's go ahead and start with our panel on Political Integrity 2.0, bringing the public interest back into political leadership. My name is Julio, Bacio, Terracino. I'm the head of the Integrity Division at the OECD. And it's a pleasure to be with you today and with our distinguished panelists. We will be looking today at the integrity of our political leaders. By this we mean the elected and appointed officials. At the OECD ourselves, we have done quite a lot of work in the past on the integrity, when we say of public officials, but mostly looking at the civil service. And although we have not completely ignored it, we have looked less at the political level, elected and appointed officials. But I think the time has come, as you may agree if you're here today. As we all know, integrity is an inherent value of our democracy that ensures that the government responds to the interests of the people. All the way, we can say in the process from the elections, or perhaps even before the elections, how the candidates are selected, all the way in the different stages to the policy implementation. Integrity in these people ensures that everybody has a voice and that elected officials represent and respond to the interest of their constituencies. And when this works well, we have a strong economy, we have integrity that ensures that the priority of resources are not wasted due to corruption or fraud or misuse. We get better policies and we strengthen trust in government. Now, as you also know, many times this doesn't work this way. And the lack of integrity by some elected or appointed officials has devastating consequences to our society. So what can we do about it? Some argue that only the electorate should oversee and enforce integrity standards if elected officials breach these standards. So the voters will decide. But time and again, this has proven to be ineffective. Integrity expectations are not always at the forefront of voters when they are have in mind pressing other issues like the economy or social concerns. So how do we strengthen the integrity of political leaders then? What standards can we expect and who should be responsible for overseeing these standards? We have with us three distinguished panelists to help us unpack these questions. And as I said earlier, why the OECD is looking at this, just to make it concrete, we are at the OECD preparing guidelines for elected and appointed officials on integrity standards. So these guidelines will support governments to foster these standards in practice and provide accountability when these standards are breached. So today's discussion will help us to inform this work at the OECD. And before giving the floor to our speakers, just a few words about the OECD, since not many of you may know. We are an intergovernmental organization composed of 38 countries, so-called the most industrialized, so the ones that have quite advanced policies in terms of governance. We will go into several rounds of questions, but just to make it as interactive as possible, if you have a question during the presentations, please raise your hand and we can stop and have a dialogue with you. But we will have also some time for questions at the end. I'd like to ask actually each of our panelists if you can introduce yourselves, who you are, and also in 1 minute or less, why you're here, why you accepted to come here. Take your time to be with us in this panel. So if I can start with you, Marie.
Yes, thanks, Julio. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Marie LINTZER. I work for the Haute Autorité for Transparency in Public Life in France. I'm the head of international partnerships there. And I'll talk a bit more about the Haute Autorité later during the panel. On the reasons why I'm here, I believe there is a global crisis of trust in public institutions, in public officials, globally, in all our democracies around the world, and working on rebuilding that trust and rebuilding that democracy, I think, is crucial, and that can happen through reinforcing political integrity. I think it's a strong demand from citizens, and this issue of political integrity and how to make sure that our public officials are aware about integrity and stand up to a certain standard is really important in that bigger conversation about corruption as part, and this political integrity seen as an important part of the prevention of corruption. So happy to be part of that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Julio. And it's a pleasure to be here and to have accepted this invitation. The reason I accepted, first, my name is Jorge Valladares. I'm the research and policy expert on political integrity at the Transparency International Secretariat. And as such, I'm also the policy lead for the work we do from the Secretariat. The reason I accepted this job is the same or similar to the reason I accepted this invitation. It has to do with the fact that the Transparency International movement, I mean, among several reasons, but one of them, which still is very strong in the work we do, is that in 2018, the Transparency International movement was trying to shape the vision for what we wanted to achieve towards 2030, identify political corruption and as the perhaps the most serious type of current and future corruption, and the root cause of other forms of corruption, estimated to persist and possibly grow across all regions. That was the conclusion of that survey. And from that moment onwards, we've tackled this issue from the solution side of things, trying to concentrate in shaping up political integrity as the response to that threat.
And thanks. Am I on? Yes. Hi, I'm Radivoje Grujic from the OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, Poland. Also intergovernmental organizations of 57 participating states. Thanks OECD for inviting me for the panel. I work as a democratic governance officer, and in our work, and to respond to the question why I accepted the invitation, we do work on the integrity, mainly on the public integrity with elected officials like parliamentarians, and we basically realize that this way or another you need to end up or to go back to basics, and that's like to work with those. These MPs are coming from somewhere, and they are basically coming mainly from political parties. Very rarely in the OSCE region you have people being elected on a ticket on their name and surname. Mainly they come on lists of parties. And if parties don't have their own integrity mechanisms developed to build up the values, why we then expect that when those politicians come into parliaments, they would simply change overnight and start exercising integrity that they didn't bring from parties. So this is what we are trying to look at, and this is why I also am happy to talk to you today on our work in this respect.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think we've heard that we are definitely, I think I would agree, about a global crisis, perhaps on democracy, related to democracy, and the demand by citizens that you just mentioned, Marie, the political corruption as the most serious for transparency in TI. And I like also this go back to basics that was mentioned. I mean, the big challenge that we will sort of navigate during this panel is, first, of course, we are talking about, there are two, I would say, significant challenges when we discuss these issues. One is the politics. Of course, this is not a abstract look at standards and corruption or integrity issues. It's all merged or sort of intertwined with politics in a given country. And that, of course, is a big, big challenge. And the second one is the frameworks around this issue, which, and I alluded to this in the beginning, which is related to the independence of the different powers. So who really has a power to control each other, especially if we talk about parliament, if we create entities that oversee these type of issues, we're starting to touch on this issue of the independence that is so entrenched and so valuable also to our democracy. So it's not an easy discussion. but it is at the end of the day about the integrity of that represent us. But what are the standards, and this is what I would like to discuss in this first round, what are the standards that we want to see elected and appointed officials to follow, and how can we cultivate these standards? So Jorge, if I can start with you, TI has set out a number of standards that elected and appointed officials need to follow. Could you elaborate a little bit on these standards, what they are, and how why TI identify them as essential?
Yes. Actually, in preparing this workshop, this panel, I consider to answer the question in several forms. And I face the dilemma of giving you a long and boring answer on every set of standards that we've come up with over the last 20 years or like 25 years, or giving you also a very long and boring description of what we've done with all this set of standards. And so I've chosen the latter because we, in 2019, decided to also revamp or like give a renewed push to our work on political integrity. And for that, we wanted to look back at what the movement and different parts within the movement had come up as recommendations and standards for different issues at the global level, but also at regional and country level. And in doing that, we had first to define political integrity, and that's where we started to identify what were the guiding goals that could help us set standards moving forward. And our definition of political integrity was very much taking the positive side of integrity, like not only defining what should not be done by public officials when holding office, but also what should be the aspirational role of these public officials. So we define political integrity as as what power holders, those who set the rules and the laws in the country, exercise their political power consistently with the common good or the public interest. That was our first and defining principle. And then, of course, not to sustain or advance their own wealth, position, or interests. And then from that, we took it in three dimensions that really reflect where our thinking is going. On the one hand, the first one is what we call inclusive power. I would say that's our main guiding goal when it comes to access to office. Access to office should be inclusive, free from undue influence. We should expose and disclose the relationships aspiring public officials have with other vested interests, and trying to so level the playing field, but also try to prevent these vested interests from interfering or penetrating the public sphere. Several issues, and we have sets of standards for several issues in this first block. Political financing, including corporate political engagement, an area the OECD also works. We have also worked on issues of state neutrality in elections, the use or abuse of state resources, and in general, other forms of election abuse. We also identify some blind spots in our work, areas in which we need new standards, such as the financing of online political advertising, etc., etc. The second area that we chose as a guiding principle for defining our own standards is equal influence. So once aspiring politicians take on office, we want to focus on how this power is exercised. And this equal influence is our guiding principle for this area of work. Under this area of work, we have worked in a wide-ranging set of issues, from conflicts of interest, lobbying, incompatibilities, pre- and post-term employment, and I would say a long number of sub-areas. You know. Here, the key for us is guaranteeing that all concerned stakeholders have the same opportunities to influence laws. And finally, and this is also perhaps one of the blind spots we had in our work, is ensuring that power that is accessed and exercised is held accountable. And for that, we were or are trying to look not only at the legal and administrative procedures or standards that exist for establishing administrative or legal liabilities, but also to the political accountability mechanisms that exist and are embedded into checks and balances, but also could come from the soft power that could be exercised by citizens, political parties themselves as the recruiters of political personnel, and this is something that we will thread carefully, the international dimension, no? How sanctions, conditionalities, and other international instruments can also help us to hold accountable for the use of this power.
Thank you, Jorge. I think you've gave us a very, very broad but also detailed framework to work with on the access, the equal influence and accountability part. Now, Marie, if turning to you, the High Authority has almost a decade of experience in promoting transparency and integrity exactly on political leaders, particularly in the area of conflict of interest and lobbying. But what, I mean, based on this experience, what challenges do you continue to face in establishing and strengthening the integrity standards of these officials? And what are the essential tools to address these challenges?
Thanks, Julio. Yeah, so maybe to step back a bit on what does the High Authority, what's its role, and that would address, I think, the question about the tools on how to promote political integrity. And I just to jump back on what you were saying about this general idea of political integrity being the means that power holders exercise their powers consistently with the common good, and I think that's overall the mission of the High Authority. And so we try to do that through multiple means. The first one is by controlling the asset declarations of public officials in France. We have about 18,000 public officials in our scope. And the reason we control their asset declaration is to detect any illicit enrichment. That's the first mission. We also, another tool is to control their declaration of interests that they have to declare at the beginning and at the end of their function or mandate. And the idea here is to prevent any potential conflicts of interest. That's been a growing topic in France and globally. I think it's interesting to note how, at least in France, the focus about 10 years ago was very much on the assets of public officials and potential corruption around these assets. And now the public discussions is focused on interest and the porosity that can exist between the private and public sphere. And I think that's when we talk about political integrity today, that's a focus and attention that we notice. So the control of declaration of interest and in the prevention of conflicts of interest is a key mission to us. Linked to that, which is also part of how to ensure political integrity, is how we also control the revolving door movement between the public and private sectors. I think today there's more and more public officials who come from the private sector and public officials who intend to join the private sector when they leave. It can be encouraged to do that. And it's very important that citizens do not doubt the reasons that motivated the adoption of a public decisions when a public official was in function. And so ensuring that this movement between the private and public sector is done without putting into question the integrity of the public administration is I think very crucial in this debate about political integrity. And so one of the important missions of the High Authority is to ensure that these movements between the public and private sector is done well and without conflict of interest. And lastly, one last mission that the High Authority does is, and linked to this political integrity portfolio, is the regulation of lobbying. interest representation in general. Again, in this, I think making sure that public decisions are not influenced by private interests. It's very important to be able to track down the legislative footprint, regulation footprint, to be able to see who has participated in the debate about a public decision. And so in France, the High Authority is in charge of a register where lobbyists have to register, and they have to declare their activities when they meet with public officials. We have some still improvements to be done around that register, but at least that's what we considered as part of the promoting transparency and political integrity, and one of the tools that we used.
Thanks, Marie. Just following up on something quickly, just to give some context. So I know the High Authority was created following a very big scandal, which is what happens always in, I think, in our field of work. But if you can just say, so you know, what is the independence, sort of just this, how independent is the High Authority?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so yeah, just to maybe go back to this scandal, was at the time the Minister of Budget in France that was in charge of the budget in France, including was in charge of regulating tax evasion, and was himself found guilty of having holding some bank accounts abroad and lying about it. So that created a real uproar in France in the public opinion, and was the beginning of there was a creation of the High Authority, of also the specific prosecutor about public officials. And so with the creation of the High Authority, what was your question about? Yeah, and so the idea when the High Authority was created was to be able to address some of these scandals about tax evasion and declaration of assets from officials. But the way it was created is that the independence of the High Authority was ensured by the board of the High Authority, which is made of a president who is appointed by the President of the Republic, but has to be approved by the Commission of Laws of the National Assembly and of the Senate, so the two houses of parliament in France. And then all decisions of the High Authority are taken by this board, which is made of 12 members plus the President of the High Authority. And these 12 members are members of the highest jurisdictions in France, so from the judiciary, from the administrative, and from the Court of Audit. And then individuals who are appointed by the government, the National Assembly, and the Senate. So this mix of people that make the board ensures the independence of the High Authority. Just one thing to add on the independence is that the mandate of the president and of the board members are non-renewable and non-revocable. They're a 6-year mandate, which again is another proof of independence.
Thank you. Just to give some context on sort of how this works, and touching a little bit on what I mentioned earlier about the independence of the power. Sort of this is, I'm not saying this is the only model, but this is one model at least that in France is, I may say, working quite well. Now, Radivoje, to your turn now. Undue influence is a major integrity risk for elected and appointed officials. What are the key standards that are needed to mitigate this specific risk, and what are the emerging challenges that you're seeing in this area?
Well, I think these two things are somehow interconnected, as when we speak about standards, and I think Marie touched upon as well, the Jorge, there is emerging trend that like you need to react swiftly on new forms that are coming up. But I think to go a little bit back is like what people consider undue influence and how influence as such is being seen and perceived in public. As we know that in some countries, when you say that a politician is being lobbied, it has a negative connotation. So I think standards should come also as like addressing the risk that is basically stigmatization of lobbying as something being seen mainly as a funky business, if I may say. So undue influence, in a way, most of people perceive that any lobbying is undue influence. And I think this is the first challenge that elected officials, appointed officials, but also those who are regulating are facing. So like promoting lobbying, promoting influence is something regular and natural, and expanding the scope of those who are allowed to do it under certain conditions that brings in transparency. That's something to basically bring back the to get electorate face the reality that like lobbying is nothing bad, but you need to really understand what stands behind, and to get people the other layer of this, like why it is important when it comes to political finance. What we usually forget, and it's like to get electorate to have an informed choice. An informed choice doesn't only mean what are the messages that politicians are giving out there, but also which money stands behind. And so like making a standard that would basically bring all these things together to people who ultimately make decision who's going to run certain country in a period of time, is also for them to understand that there is nothing bad about it if it's regulated, if it's allowed, and for certain categories there are certain aspects that need to be more detailedly regulated. And for this, the next thing is to give enough capacity to those who are overseeing. I know that the French authority is a good example, but countries that we are working with at the OSCE region, unfortunately, very often you see quite opposite. So there is a legislation, and then people say we need more. But maybe you don't need more legislation, you need more capacity, more resources to grant to these authorities. And overall, to have them being perceived as an independent body, because independence doesn't come from like just putting it in the law. If subjects of their control don't see them as independent, meaning political parties, candidates, if they don't see these agencies as independent, then the law can grant whichever authority to these agencies, but you won't have a result. And then as a negative result, you're gonna have a low trust and people deciding not to go into this like muddy waters of politics because they say, oh, there is some blurred line and there is some money that we can't really control and follow. So I'm not gonna put my vote forward because I don't really know what's behind these political actors. So I think, I don't know if I answered your question straightforward, but linking challenges with standards, I think to start back with how people perceive certain elements, which we somehow forget usually, that like lobbying is still perceived as something bad. At least this is what we see in our interaction with parliaments and parties, but civil society as well.
Yes, this is definitely one of the challenges which is making this really the difference between what is, I would say, like a constructive influence or engagement between business or other stakeholders and government, and what we call undue. I mean, just to clarify, I mean, undue, without going into the details, we're talking, I mean, I think you imagine, you get the picture, but by undue, we think ways in which are not transparent, that in which the whoever is trying to engage with government does it in a way to deceive or to manipulate the government in their benefit. You mentioned some actors that I think I want to share with the audience here, some numbers that we have that are really worrying, and I think calling for even more and more work in this area. So when we talk about the legislative power, in a recent study that we did at the OECD on trust in the legislature, we found that on average in OECD countries, only 39.4% of respondents to the survey trust the legislative. So this is very, very low, 39.4. Also, we know that trust on political parties is also very low, 55.5 in these type of surveys. And then we also see, as I mentioned earlier, that many times in many countries, despite being quite obvious about allegations or even cases against political leaders. Nevertheless, these are elected into office after this. So that, again, that accountability mechanism doesn't always work. So now perhaps I'd like to discuss a little bit on this point. Continuing with you, Radivoje, how do you see this balance between these two mechanisms? Is there a role for governance mechanisms beyond the elections to hold elected officials accountable?
There are obviously, as we may discuss how effective they are, and that's the one aspect of it. Elected officials usually, what we do when we work with them, we speak about parliamentarians, and we mainly work with them on like adopting or assessing and improving their codes of conduct for MPs. What strikes me always is that when we get engaged with them, the first thing they ask is like, okay, so what I'm allowed and what I'm not allowed to do. So it's always about norms. It's always about certain rules and what happens to me if I violate it. What's the sanction and how I go around it. And they look at us when we come with and I think Delia was mentioning today at the opening remarks, like we need less norms, we need more values and more like promoting. But our challenge mainly when we come to work with politicians, with elected parliamentarians, is like they don't really get to it. For them, the only time that they get a bit like incentivized is that when they say, okay, but where it leads, and I say, well, it leads that like how I don't get sanctioned. Well, you may get sanctions in 4 years' time on the next election if your electorate doesn't get to. So like there is always a mechanism, but I would basically focus more on those that are present at all times in public and how the public reacts. And I think Jorge and I had an interesting talk 2 days ago with a colleague from TI chapter from Britain, that there is a conclusion that electorate, that public opinion doesn't really much now get shocked and on all these scandals that are coming around. And this is where basically the governance and like the values that we speak about, I think that the rooting back to those who are making decisions, and here I really think of the wider society of people who have right to vote, that's where mainly when parties work with them, these things are never on the high level, high up on the agenda. And I mean, I can talk a bit later on like some research that we are doing with parties, because like we really want to dig up and see how parties, how much highly they feature the ethics and integrity in their internal works. And what we see is not really promising. So,
thanks. We'll definitely get back to that, because I think political parties is an actor that has not been sufficiently engaged in these discussions. And I was taking note on something that you made me think of how we are moving from tolerance to resignation in some countries. We talk a lot about tolerance, but I think we are beyond that, unfortunately, in some places at least. Marie, now, I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on something similar. How do we respect this balance between this electoral accountability and more formal accountability mechanisms?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. I think that links to your question about the independence of the oversight authority, because if you do have in your scope the legislative branch, by definition you need an oversight body that is independent. And I mentioned the composition of our boards as an important factor to ensure that independence, plus the different mandates of the board members and the president. And I think you can either have one oversight institution like ours in France that oversees elected officials, in which case the independence is crucial, or if you have if you have like an authority by branch, then there needs to be to work together at least to ensure that the ethical standards are common. And that's in France we do. There is a commission. If you take the parliament, you have a commission at the National Assembly and at the Senate that deals with ethics of parliamentarians and also deals with conflicts of interest of parliamentarians. And we are this independent oversight body, but we work very closely with them to ensure that our standards and what we recommend is accepted by MPs, and that it doesn't come from nowhere. And I think that work between administration and between branches is really crucial. I was just talking before to the US government ethics office, so in charge of government ethics, and they were telling me that they were overseeing only the executive branch, that they could not have any powers over the legislative branch or the judiciary, which is a bit different from our system. But again, to ensure that oversight, you need a balance, and you need to ensure the independence of the authority that does that. So.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned these commissions, because this actually the model in France is not present in most countries, perhaps around the world, but most countries do have, especially the legislators, their own sort of self-control, if we can say, commissions with successes and failures, perhaps we can say like that. But well, France has this extra added sort of mechanism with a high authority, and as well, you just gave one example. In the United States, for example, there is not such similar mechanism for the legislator. And Jorge, on your side, how do you see this balance between this electoral accountability, perhaps self-regulating bodies within the legislature, and then on the other hand, governance, or if we can call them like that, governance and accountability mechanisms?
Yeah, I'll try to also, just for the sake of expanding the discussion, think of those mechanisms that are also part of the governance arrangements that may be our blind spots. No? Russia already referred to the role of political parties there, etc. So I would suggest that, of course, there is an issue with independence. There is a risk always to use or abuse rules or integrity standards to coerce politicians into certain or to abstain from doing things. It's mostly in countries that are going through some degree of democratic backsliding, etc. But I would say perhaps we should also try to pay attention. You also mentioned it as something that we may have not paid enough attention yet to those other external but soft accountability mechanisms that do exist, that ensure the independence of the elected politicians, but also bring them back to the rules of the game, no? Like and I'm referring to ensuring that political contestation, for instance, is guaranteed in the governance mechanisms, opportunities for the opposition to debate, discuss policy, also the issue of the role of that political parties can play as external oversight institutions for their own members that are recruited. Of course, here, and just to, this is the example I perhaps wanted to put forward as one area in which we, at least from the community of pro-integrity community, we should perhaps also try to link up to the democracy systems players, is that, of course, political parties play a role in the recruitment and the political personnel, and perhaps less now they contribute to the socialization of these political socialization of these politicians, the elected officials. But they still play a role in the recruitment. They nominate candidates, they do some screening or vetting mechanisms before doing that. And they do have some power over them, because they, on these organizations depend the ability to run for re-election or to stand a chance to keep advancing their own political careers. So, and I think there is a space there for us to perhaps bring political parties and other political recruitment actors, CSOs, business. You mentioned many elected officials are coming also from the business sector, to enhance, perfect their own ethical standards and mechanisms to ensure that elected officials come into the political arena with a higher sophistication, awareness of where the line between the private and the public lies. I would say the chair of TI Portugal is an academic who recently did some research on the role of political parties' ethic commissions, that they have over their own elected politicians. And they found that, interestingly, in countries where there is high, or there is high level of trust or perceptions, or positive perceptions about corruption, like meaning the least perceived corrupt countries, parties tend to have less of these standards or mechanisms. But in countries where there is the perceptions of corruption are run higher, parties tend to compensate for that by having these mechanisms. They, of course, do not operate well in practice, because this also depends on the trust members or the ability of members or other actors to really abide by these rules. But anyways, I'm thinking that to think about the independence of elected officials, but we should also think that at the end of the day, they have pledged to govern under certain principles, to commit to certain goals, to deliver on certain policies. And perhaps the rules or the incentives that we should use as well, or to try to incentivize from society, is that they keep adhering to these goals and norms when they are governing, and they compete over policy rather than other issues.
Thanks, Jorge. I mean, all of you mentioned different actors, or I would argue sort of ways in which we can implement these standards. So we've heard sort of the areas that are covered or should be covered, about conflict of interest, lobbying, even from the beginning, from the moment the candidate is selected in a political party. So if we think of how we translate these standards into action and into being really implemented, we need to think of actors or entities, some of which you have mentioned, and especially now political parties. Jorge, you were mentioning them, but also other actors are the ones, like perhaps like the High Authority and others, commissions, etc., that oversee this. We can go a bit more in detail, perhaps in some of these actors. Now we mentioned a lot political parties, so Radivoje, if you can tell us a bit about the work that you have done with political parties, because integrity does not start, of course, when officials take office, but it should and could start during the electoral process. And what do you see? What is the role that political parties are playing or could be playing more?
Yeah, well, it basically all starts with them and ends with them. It's just the way we work with parties. It's like working with parties, with people from the parties who are holding few different hats at the moment. So the challenge is that if you want to work with parties directly, for organization like ours, they are not committed to you in any ways. They are not an institution as like parliament is. But then the way we do is like working with their factions in parliaments. Now again, it doesn't encompass all those parties that are outside, but at least the major ones, the mainstream. And then basically, like I mentioned in my previous intervention, the major challenge is like to really invest the time to talk to them on like changing the narrative. And that's where you realize that party leadership, even once you convince them to do so, are getting big challenges within their structures, because in countries where politics is seen as a gray zone, and where the narrative is that they are all the same, and we have to handle it the way it is. When they come with a innovative solutions saying like we need to start promoting, we need to create our own integrity mechanisms, the challenge for the parties is to basically get along this with their traditional like stand points that are some strong wings in the parties are having. The way we do this is still really like trying to get them incentives speaking about what they do in between electoral cycles. And obviously some work that we do, and we are mapping like what, first of all, we were thinking like if we want to approach parties, we need to know what is it out there. Because with parliaments, it's easy. They either have or they don't have some mechanism, and it's there on web. But with parties, as they are much bigger crowd and very much informal and very much non-transparent, unfortunately. So what we see is that even those parties who are having some mechanism, very rarely you will see it on their web pages. Or when you say ethical rules and how much it plays in, we say we have it in our statute. And then you open the statute and there is one line there. So they're not really having things developed, and then even those few that we saw they're having, and it's like some 10% of those that we are covering at the moment, that are having some interdisciplinary bodies that are vetting candidates or even new members, it doesn't go that far and thorough. It's more of a, yes, we do have it, but when you look in depth of there, like what are the things that you are looking at, you are getting nothing really. There is no like in-depth questionnaires, interviews, or like vetting. So, and then like for membership, more or less, yes, you should be open. But when you see that this is the very same level of vetting when it comes to selecting candidates for a high elected positions, that's when you realize that basically there is not really an honest really push and wish from the behind of the men. And very often it also comes from the point that party management does not have trust in other structures within the party to give them, to grant them, to delegate, to say, okay, we're going to have a vetting committee. No, it's usually with a very few people within the party executives. Now it also comes back, in some countries they claim that because all the decisions are with party executives, which usually don't get elected, but just are behind the scenes, it also comes to their level of knowledge from where the money comes to the party. So their argument is that, well, in our party, it's only a chairperson and a secretary who knows where money comes from. So this prevents our MPs, or futurely elected MPs, of like voting in the parliament on certain policies based on the fact who gives us money, because they don't know. Now, the perception whether the MPs really don't know where that money comes from, formally they don't, but do we really think they are not aware of it? So I think there is a lot of reluctance. There is a goodwill, but then you open up the Pandora's box, and very often the management, even when they have a wish, they know that the moment they open it up, when they have a wish to really integrate in their party internal procedures more of these ethics and integrity, they are jeopardizing their own position. So now the question for them is like, do you want to go that path and be someone who's going to lose the floor? Or you are still risking, but if you manage to do it, you're going to be a pioneer in your party and bring up something good. So this is like, just in a short, like a lot of challenges ahead, but obviously there are some moves, and newly established parties are basically reaching out, understanding the need for this, the accountability. And what we didn't expect when we started mapping this is that mapping would basically trigger some parties approaching us and saying, can you help us develop the mechanism? Now we are just at the very beginning of it. I can't tell you how successful it's going to be, because I say, like what we saw so far, the moment you start digging up further, there is reluctance. Now, how strong the party management is to fight that, I think that's what dependence is, like how successful they're going to be in it or not.
Thanks. I would add just one point, which is also a way of seeing this is sometimes we see in some countries that we always end up with the same candidates. And I think this is a nice proxy perhaps to show how the selection outside of integrity concerns, but I think there is a connection there that, you know, in 20 years, the same one party always has the same candidate, which sometimes even loses every time. But there, you can see that there's no way that the party can break with that internally. But so, I think we've made quite clear that there's a lot of work to be done within parties and with political parties. Now, a bit outside of, I mean, before I ask my just two last questions to Jorge and Marie, please get ready with your own questions or comments. So right after that, I will turn to you. Jorge, beyond the parties, are there other institutions that play a role in overseeing this, and what role should they play, and on what factors can enable their success?
Beyond parties, but before that, so just also to bring some nuance to what Rasha was presenting, and I would say that, of course, since political party systems are renewing constantly, and we've seen many party systems collapse, I think it's also important to see, not only collapse, but also expanding through their extremes. We also tend to see that new parties, either of the extremes, tend to be highly personalized and relying on personal leaderships, and they tend to have less reliance on codified rules to govern this ethical behavior. So that, I think that's also consistent with something that we found in some small research that actually Jon led at the Transparency International Secretariat, that also says that voters with I think it was in the case of the EU, voters with Eurosceptic views tend to have lesser degrees of trust in politics in general, and tend to also have how can I say it, like, if I remember correctly, less negative evaluations of the integrity of the political system as such, no, that they doesn't deliver on these outcomes. But this is something that may also help us think of how to approach the issue of parties. But then, just also to take on the question, and now in the fly, because so what other institutions we may think may play a role? I think that, for instance, when we think of political finance regulations, this is one of the areas that in which obligations are mostly focused on political parties themselves, and this the oversight or the policing of these obligations is given to an oversight institution that could be the Electoral Commission, etc. But more and more we see that there are also other actors that play a role in shaping up electoral outcomes. I would, for instance, think of paid communications advertising. And this is also happening in other spheres, like not only in broadcast or print, but also online media. I think it's about time for us also to think that these integrity standards should also apply to these actors that are, in a way, gatekeepers or through which most of these resources, but also the influence on electoral outcomes depends on. That would also demand different type of oversight, or different types, or different rules or methods to exert oversight over these institutions. Of course, the capacities of oversight institutions are key here, because one thing is to monitor what's being broadcast on TV, and a totally different deal is to monitor what's being spent on online advertising, given the complexities of that issues. So I'm thinking that perhaps we should also move towards, in those countries that are willing to tackle these issues, I mean, or to try to curve different entry points for undue influence, we should also think that that there may be other actors or other oversight, different type of skills or capacities in the oversight that should also be brought into the fore, so we can have effective oversight of these issues.
Thanks. Thank you. Definitely sort of expanding also, because this is not something that can be done by one actor alone. And now the last question, Marie, to you, sort of based on, again, on the high authorities' experience, if you can share with us what is this accountability role, how does it look in practice at the high authority, and if there's any official or actor that is not covered by your framework, and if somebody is not covered, how do you think we could work, sort of perhaps raise awareness at least, or in a softer way, work with these actors?
Yeah, so maybe to start with who is covered. I mentioned before that we have in our scope at the high authority about 18,000 public officials, meaning that they are the one who have to declare their assets and interests to the high authority. Who are these public officials? There are elected officials like MPs, French, European MPs, local executives have to submit a declaration, but also non-elected officials like members of government, cabinet staff, ambassadors, for example, senior civil servants. All of these people have to submit a declaration. So it's interesting because 18,000 people can seem a lot or not. I know that when I exchanged with Mexico, for example, it was interesting. They were like, "You have only 18,000 people in your scope." Well, they had about 4 million. Romania has about 1 million of people in their scope. I think the reason behind this rather small scale, I guess, compared to other countries, is that the idea was to control only very senior and strategic positions, and to ensure that the declarations that we were publishing, which is not the 18,000 declarations, but only a small part of them, is that we would publish only declarations that are controlled by us, that have been checked, which is not the case in many countries. That said, it's interesting that we always have recommendations from international organizations like the Greco, the Council of Europe, or like the UN, asking to include more public officials in our scope, and they usually ask for more positions to be included, but also to include ascendants and descendants of public officials in our scope, which in France there has been a decision by the Constitutional Court saying that there is right to privacy, and so children should not be included. So it's a whole debate, and it's interesting to see sometimes what international organizations are pushing for, and how this scope. Who is excluded from that scope? I think to answer very briefly on that is that we do not have judges in our declarations. So that doesn't mean that they do not have to declare anything. They have to submit declarations to the Superior Council of the Magistrature. So they have their own control mechanism, but this is not something done by the high authority. I think, and we haven't been pushing for having more public officials in our scope, but I think there can be a debate about, yes, why are they excluded, and maybe it would be good to have this independent oversight body checking on their interests and assets. But I'll put it here. Just to add, maybe something of a very specific thing in France is that, so I mentioned this 18,000 public officials, but we also have control a much broader number of people when we talk about the revolving door movement. So when public servants, and so that's about 6 million people in France, it's about 10% of the population. it's when these civil servants move to the private sector or want to move to the private sector, they need to ask their administration, their own hierarchy in their administration, and if there is an issue with the project, then there is that last resort can be to ask the high authority. But in theory, in our scope, we also have this entire civil service. So that's a lot of people. So I wouldn't say that I would say that's quite big and broad, and so it's not. We wouldn't be pushing for having more more in our scope. Thanks.
Thanks, Marie. I think you touched on two things I'd like to highlight, which is perhaps first is the judges. So I think we've not covered the judiciary so much, but goes to the point that I think I've repeated it several times, which is about the independence and the challenges that brings when the different branches of government, of course, want to keep this independent, but at the risk of no control at all. Sometimes self-control is not control, but sometimes it works. And then another point that you raised is about whether we should cover more or less. I definitely agree. So you looked at me twice about the international organizations asking for more. We never do that. But actually, I can share with you an anecdote in working in one country in which our recommendation was that they should cover less. So of course, if you do less, you would do it better. And starting perhaps top down, if we can think about sort of a hierarchy. Because this is what happens. Sometimes you cover millions as you're sharing, and in the end you cover no one, and especially the sort of at a higher level, political level, they escape. But the problem about the anecdote is that it was politically impossible also for the government to come up with a policy that would actually reduce the control. And as you can imagine, this has a political cost that it cannot be borne by almost any government. So we are in this challenge also that's unfortunately, and I agree with you, at the request sometimes of international organizations, some countries have expanded to millions the control, which is not, although with technology perhaps a little bit easier, but it's still not possible. And now it's almost impossible to go back, because then there's going to be a backlash from public opinion, because it will be perceived as, they're reducing controls instead of increasing them.
Can I ask,
please go ahead.
Just taking advantage that we're on topic. So, what are the main obstacles for the expansion? Is it in the capture of the information, the reporting, or is in the verification part of the task?
Can I answer it? Yeah, it's completely on the resource side. And I think if you want to cover 4 million people, I think that's great, but you just need an authority that has the means and the resources in terms of human resources and financial resources to be able to do the checks. And I think even if some of it can be automated, which is not the case in France, you still need human intelligence behind the declarations to be able to compare assets and interests and to be able to evaluate a conflict of interest. So, and I think for that you need more resource.
Thanks. So please, your questions or comments. Oh, okay. I was worried nobody would have questions, but I see a lot. So, but we have time. It's fine. Now, I think we just need to, if I can, maybe John or. So if you can raise your hands, maybe we start with the gentleman here, then we go back.
Yes. All four of you mentioned the fact that even though there are some politicians that have been found guilty of some crimes or of corruption or whatever, they go back and they get reelected. Okay? In the Americas, in the American continent, in the recent 2 weeks, we've seen the president of the former president of Brazil being reelected, even though who was accused and reaccused and such and such. Today, we see the United States announcing that they found the Trump organization guilty of 9 cases of fraud and whatever. And in Argentina, the sitting vice president, is found guilty also of corruption and fraud, but she's still vice president and she cannot be touched because she is vice president. And a lot of Argentinians are saying if that she would run again, she will probably win again. My question is, why? How do you explain that? And I'm giving you three different type of countries, completely three different kind of countries, education, whatever. What is it that makes the people fanatism, they're fanatics, or what is it?
I mean, if I may, I think that's a very big question, can perhaps be replied from science, but I have Max Weber to reply your question. I just ran into a quote that I found it very interesting that addresses exactly that. In the 20s, or at the beginning of the 20th century, he was doing research in the US and asking workers why they related in the, I mean, where, he basically asked, and I'm going to quote now, because this is a lecture he gave. When asked why they allow themselves to be governed by politicians whom they admitted they despised, the answer was, we prefer having people in office whom we can spit upon rather than a caste of officials who spit upon us, as in the case of you, referring to the German background of Max Weber. I mean, I don't have any answer, but I thought this problem that you were mentioning is been with us for not just the last decade or two, but since the beginning of the 20th century.
Anybody wants to add anything from the panel?
I maybe just as an observation, and going back to like how it became not anymore like a shaming. Perhaps these candidates have so many other qualities that is important to electorate. I'm just now guessing, and that on their scale, the fact that they've been accused and prosecuted and sentenced, not pretty much important, but I think this tells us a lot about how we need to work with those to change perceptions. Because I don't know what's, I would wonder myself, I see it back home, to be honest as well, but I don't have an answer.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up because I'm in the back. My name is Jasmina Mrsho. I come from the European Network of Political Foundations from Brussels. We are the largest network of political foundations in Europe across the political spectrum. Our members work with political parties, but also with civil society. And because we work with political parties, I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Grujic, because we work around the globe on different programs, but one of them is integrity of political leaders as well. So I wanted to ask you about the access points that you determine in reaching and political parties and trying to work with them. You've mentioned parliamentary bodies and parliamentarians, etc. Have you identified any other access points? Because you have said that political parties are quite closed organizations, and even for us as political foundations who have kind of a unique access to them, it's hard to actually reach the right people who would implement certain integrity standards. And the second question is regarding the vetting process. Sometimes in emerging democracies, especially in smaller parties and opposition parties that have emerged from grassroots movements, it's not an issue of prioritization of the integrity standards, but more of a lack of proper resources, human resources and funding to do an in-depth vetting process. So I was just wondering if you have taken this into account as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, to answer the second question, I think if I recall well, because we are just now getting the data of some research we are doing, I think only 10% of parties that we looked at are having human resources unit, or call it whatever you wish. So like that they have a personnel that deals with these issues. Usually it's just on an ad hoc basis. So this tells a lot, and we see that. So we are pretty much aware. And speaking of the access points, honestly, that's the biggest struggle for us as well. And okay, for us, from the point of intergovernmental organization, the parties are not accountable to us. It's the state institutions. So the way we are looking at, we are trying to reach out to party leadership through working with their parliamentary factions, not because we think the factions are the ones that are holding the core of the work on integrity, but if that's the only channel for us, that's what we're going to use. And I think the only one that was coming up to our mind, but that doesn't apply in every country, is where you have a developed system and culture of political foundations, or like spin-offs of different political parties. That is probably one way around to come to like as an access point. But then again, I think if you look at it globally, I don't think you will find that as an access point in most of the countries. So it is a bit troublesome. So sorry, I can't give you a much more incentive answer, but that's just reality.
Yeah, hello, my name is Kim. I'm a researcher at Stanford University, and I work in Mexico. I guess one word or concept that hasn't really been mentioned in today's discussion, but we've kind of circled around it, is the concept of political populism. The gentleman here was talking about 3 cases, the United States, Argentina, and Brazil, which all share that sort of tradition of political populism. And there's really not a lot of literature that links corruption with populism. So we at Stanford have sort of started the process of embarking on a study that looks at how political populism shapes individual propensities of engaging in corruption. I guess my question is one of, we've talked about how does political integrity look, Jorge, you had these 3 criteria, and populism, in a sense, threatens all 3 of them. My question is one of how can we also, as an international community, think about the political incentives and logics that shape the interest of political leaders in order for our integrity recommendations really to be able to compete with the appeal of populism. Because we can give them a very long report with things that work. We know, we can talk about integrity, what are the steps that need to be taken, institutional measures. But the thing is with populism is it's a personalized attack on the institutions that pretend or that should be fighting against corruption. So how can we create an institutional sort of discourse that can integrate the logic of the political game and present a viable alternative for the electorate, so we don't have to second guess ourselves? Why is this happening in Brazil? Why is this happening in the US? Why is it happening in Mexico?
Thank you, Kim. So the way I would approach this in the way of formulating questions rather than the answers, how to approach and understand this, how the process of how populism gets in the way of integrity, to put it that in that way, to me has to do with perhaps the way public discourse is shaped. I think one of the key means for populist leaders to get away with corruption, etc., is the priming of issues. No, I think they are very successful using the information ecosystem to prime cultural identity issues, etc., over other considerations, problems in society. These polarizing strategies, are very often successful in this context, and I think they can win elections on these issues rather than the whole palette of or catalog of issues. That would be one strategy that I think is proved successful, and perhaps it also applies to several of the cases that you just mentioned in Brazil, in the US, etc. Of course, the other one is using corruption itself as a tool. Populists also use in this binary representation of the polity, the us and you against the people, and the corrupt elite. So basically, that corrupt elite element is key, essential to distinguish themselves, set aside, and then from there, basically use what we just described, this priming of certain specific issues over the rest. So I would say and this is the very limited answer I have for this, I think we need to unpack the process in these two different phases. First, access to power, like what happens at that moment, how this public discourse shaped in a way that allows for this to take place. And then the second has to do with, once in power, the weakening of checks and balances that populism usually tends to, these concentrations of powers that occur and happen. I think our discussion today is being more focused on, or can be tapped upon, that specific part of the process of that I mean, if you will look at it in a dynamic way, but we should also try to pay attention more and more to what happens in the formation of these leaderships. But Kim, I don't know if this answers your question, but I think it's a very interesting way what we can use to reflect on this and think of new ways of working.
Hi, I'm Ivana Korajlić from TI Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm glad that you mentioned political parties because, I mean, as Radivoje said, they are the start and the end of most of and a lot of the problems related to political integrity and corruption. We have all these international standards and recommendations related to individual appointed or elected officials, conflict of interest, assets declarations, how to monitor. When it comes to political parties, we have maybe focus on financing of political parties, general transparency, but we don't have that much focus on internal democracy mechanisms when we talk about political parties and internal integrity mechanisms. And there's always, of course, explanation, we can't go into too much regulation when it comes to how the parties will organize themselves. But if this is one of the roots of the problems, how they actually function, whether there are any internal mechanisms to improve democratic mechanisms in terms of avoiding the same people being always candidates or elected, or at least having some kind of accountability to their members and the public. Is there a space to basically push for having international recommendations and standards to regulate at least minimum internal democracy and accountability and integrity mechanisms when it comes to political parties? Because I think it would be very useful for us as organizations when we advocate for these kinds of solutions.
Well, I can only say that there were always ideas of that you treat those political parties who are receiving public money as kind of a subject of control, and as such to try to impose through legislation that all those, just like if you are receiving public money, if you're a public institution, you should have developed integrity plan or something like that. So now when it comes to developing international standards on that, I think Julio and I can tell, I mean, at least I speaking from my own organization, especially at this particular point, knowing that we cannot reach consensus on anything, and that's the way we do. OSCE is a consensus-based organization. At least at this particular moment, we don't even have an annual budget adopted, so not to go further. But that's because of the specific current political situation and one member participating state would have. But I think even without that, it is a challenging thing. First of all, to define the scope, and then to say, okay, but how you do that? Do you do it through legislation? Do you do it through some incentives? And what are the repercussions for those who don't do it? Because you can't start banning political parties if they don't. So I think opening up the floor to discuss it, I definitely think it's something that we are missing and we would be all benefiting from.
Can I quickly just add? Yeah, sorry.
Russia, you do have a 110-page long regulation on political parties from a year now.
So just wanted to say that indeed, yeah, the Venice Commission has this model regulation, and I think the OAS has also attempted to do this. They end up being very bulky and pieces of work made by experts. But I just want to say to Ivana that indeed at the Secretariat we're thinking whether it's about time for us to also engage in the process of standard setting when it comes to the relationship between money and politics, and politics. I think at least on that narrow area, but it could include also other issues of inclusiveness in decision making and other areas in which I think there is being already a lot of progress, but the ethical part and the money influence part are still under considered.
My name is Josephine, but I would like to speak in French if there's someone that can translate for me, because I'm more comfortable in French than English. I'm from DRC, and je crois que par rapport au thème qui est de l'intérêt public dans le leadership politique, je pense que j'aimerais bien savoir si le fait que la communauté internationale interfère, permettez-moi le terme, interfère dans les élections au niveau présidentiel, par exemple, parce qu'ils ont leurs propres intérêts, les intérêts étatiques, qui ne concernent pas forcément la population, alors que la population a des choix de candidats. Par exemple, je donne un exemple, il y a 2 candidats qui font la course aux élections présidentielles, mais que l'un des candidats ne correspond pas aux intérêts de la communauté internationale et qui impose d'une façon ou d'une autre le choix de ce candidat-là, quand bien même il n'a pas gagné aux élections. Est-ce que vous, en tant qu'expert de Transparence, et vous ne pensez pas que c'est un acte de corruption? Parce que déjà le fait que la communauté internationale s'en mêle et que ça arrive jusqu'au niveau des juges qui confirment la présence, qui confirment les élections de ce candidat-là qui, entre parenthèses, est plutôt accepté par la communauté internationale plutôt que de la population, parce que c'est de l'intérêt public qu'il s'agit. Ne pensez-vous pas que là aussi c'est une sorte de corruption ou un manque de transparence dans les élections? Voilà.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'll translate in a shorter version for the whole audience. I think the question was when we're talking about political integrity, the fact that sometimes the international community or a third country, I would say, or another country interferes in the elections of another country because a candidate is not convenient for that other country. So and the question is whether this interference could not be also called corruption. Who would like to take this question from the panel?
No, thank you, Josephine. We just recently, with the National Democratic Institute and the Open Government Partnership, produced a brief that more or less scans the landscape when it comes to one form of foreign interference that can lead to corruption. That is part of the catalog that some authoritarian or kleptocratic regimes use to influence decision-making in foreign countries, and that's foreign political financing that very usually uses illicit channels to, it can be in cash, contributions in cash, I mean, if, like literally with bags of money, like in Madagascar, or in Latin America, some alleged cases of cash being infused into campaigns in several countries of Latin America from Venezuela. But then I would say yes, and we should also think of foreign interference as a perhaps more complex issue that leads to corruption. And foreign political financing is one, and there is a number of things that we can do that are very basic. We don't even need to change the laws, but we just need to make them applicable in several countries. Already have bans on foreign political financing that are not very well implemented or are very narrowly understood when implemented. But then other forms of foreign interference that we should also look at as part of this strategic corruption in foreign affairs may also be financial coercion, no? Through debt, lending mechanisms that can also affect outcomes in recipient countries. And of course, disinformation and misinformation campaigns that are sponsored from abroad and are also one of these tools that are used to interfere or advance commercial interests of state-owned enterprises of these countries, or just basically being hostile to the outcomes of the elections.
So just to move on, we can discuss if you want separately later, because at the OECD we're doing quite a lot of work also in these areas.
Okay, I'm Navaluna. I work for a governmental anti-corruption agency in Madagascar, and I have a question for Mrs. Marie. I want to know if the high authorities in charge of the control of electoral campaigns accounts, and if not, who is in charge, and how the non-respect of legal deposit of this electoral campaigns accounts are sanctioned in France. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer quickly. Thanks for the question. It's not the high authority. There is another agency in charge of le Centre National des Comptes des sorry, CNCCFP. I don't know if you can help me. It's another specific agency in charge of for electoral questions. We can discuss a bit more if you want further after.
Yes. Hello, I'm Michael Porras. I'm the mayor of Sarchi, a small town in Costa Rica. I have two questions. Do you have any experience with local governments on those issues? And does the OECD have a community of practice or working group with local governments on these issues, or local authorities but that have been elected or have in the political parties, but in local governments, not at the country level, but in the local level? Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to see that we have also a representative of the community we are discussing so much. So I'm very happy that you're with us, because it's also all about engaging with you. I would say yes, in an informal basis. We work a lot, or as much as we can, we are engaged with local governments. Informally, I would say they're not part of the formal committees, etc. that we have. But I just come from a conference on integrity issues at local government. So we do work because many of the challenges are the same. It depends how the governments are organized. I mean, in this country, in the United States, actually the local governments are significant. I would say they're as big as some countries. So there's a lot to learn from them in these cases that sometimes can be sort of extrapolated into national level. So we could discuss if you want a bit later. I think we have a question here in the front, and then you, sir. And then these are the two last ones, unfortunately.
Thank you. Very briefly, my name is Sandra Martinez. I'm from Colombia, from the Colombian chapter of Transparency International. And you were talking about different actors to bring to the table, but I wonder, and I would like to ask you, how to bring along private sector. And this does not really only has to do with the private funds for campaigns or political parties, but because they have the power to set the public agenda as well. So some ideas maybe of how to bring them along.
Well, I just listening to you as I'm scrolling down, living in Warsaw, Poland, which is a very big business hub, you can see that a lot of vacancies, more and more emerging for companies like, I don't know, Amazon, Google, Meta, for like governance and policy advisors. And this is something, I mean, I lived there for almost 10 years, and I see these kind of jobs being opened more and more in the last couple of years. What I want to say, if these companies recognize the need to have people dealing with these issues. Maybe this is the way to bring private businesses on board, to bring people from these companies. I mean, I don't know, because we are working with completely different. We don't have any engagement with the private sector, but this is simply my private observation, because I didn't see these kind of openings and job profiles in some private businesses in the last 2 decades, but I think it's emerging last few years. So that's probably where we should seek, as someone asked, for an entry point for parties. I think this is also like entry point for private sector, to seek for companies who have profiled positions within there. This means that they already start caring about it, so that could be a starting point.
Hi, John Devitt from TI Ireland. I was just firstly a quick technical question to Marie. Is the register capturing details of public representatives or appointed officials' liabilities as well as assets, loans, for example? And then secondly, a more abstract one. Has the panel witnessed any effort made to open a dialogue with political representatives about what they mean by integrity, a dialogue around values? Because we do witness it in the business ethics sphere, particularly at the C-suite. There's a lot of effort being made to engage with executive leaders in the private sector to reflect on what they mean, what their values are. And it's often, we see it in companies which are engaged in this reflection and dialogue around ethical values, and as well as their corporate values. So I just, the first question to Marie, and the other to the panel as a whole.
Yes, and quick answer, yes, the declaration of assets also includes liabilities like loans for all public officials.
What's the threshold for disclosure in value?
In value is everything. Yeah.
Julio, you do surveys, no? With leaders from business.
Yeah, just start on that point. We do have a network that was a bit dormant during COVID, but actually just the 28th of November, of parliamentarians at the OECD. That actually involves not only OECD countries. Most parliamentarians that participate are not from OECD countries, from all regions, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and also Europe, in which we have these types of discussions, but we're starting sort of to going back, because actually your point is crucial. Just to give you an example, some of the parliamentarians were raising, when we talk about conflict of interest or revolving doors, in some countries, to name one, Switzerland, but there are others, parliamentarians have a job. Actually, their main job is not to be a parliamentarian. They have a job in the private sector. So how do you regulate conflict of interest when it's the way the system works? So we need to really understand in terms of framework, but then understand in terms of values. You're right. And the same, I would say, to your question on the private sector, we also involve a lot also with private sectors to get their input, especially when we talk about how they engage with business, with government. I'm sorry. If you allow me just 2 minutes self-promotion, I'd like to share with you but something that is relevant to this discussion. So if you can play the slide, please. It's just to share with you, we have here, just yesterday we released the OECD indicators that measure a lot of the issues in countries, a lot of the issues and frameworks that we discussed today. So if you're interested, please scan the code and then you can explore. You could see, for example, a lot of what Marie has not said, a lot of the details of the work they do. You will find it there, perhaps addressing some of the questions. I think we've covered a lot of points from populism all the way to sort of a lot of political parties, the different actors, including business, and also the entities that do this oversight, and the balance between, going back to that point very early on, the balance between mechanisms that are designed, such as the High Authority, for example, as a governance mechanisms for oversight and control, and also raising awareness and working. They don't only do control. So of working and socializing some of these values, to others, which is sort of at the end of the day the electoral one, the ultimate accountability mechanism that sometimes works, but sometimes, as we saw, doesn't. So with this, I'd like to ask you if we can give a warm applause for our panelists for their work. And thank you also very much to you for being with us today. Thank you very much.